Hi guys, welcome back to Rain Reads. I'm back. I didn't make a video on Monday, so today I will do two videos. I'm going to record one video and then another one and post them both to make up for the one I missed on Monday. Okay, let's begin. When Elora awoke at last, Gilvin saw with a relief that made his knees bend that she was still Elora. Her gaze was weak but clear, and she looked around for him at once, knowing that he would be there. He sat down abruptly on the edge of their bed, and when she felt for his hand, it was as cold and strengthless as hers. They felt each other's blood begin to flow again in the touching palms, but with the blood came tears. Lynadel, their Lynadel, was gone. "We will look for her," Elora said at last. "We must look for her. No one has ever thought to look." Gilvin thought about this. In the long, narrow well of their grief, it seemed perfectly reasonable, and that no one had ever sought a fairy-stolen child before was irrelevant. "Where shall we begin?" Elora sat up. "I will show you. Where are my clothes?" Her ladies-in-waiting, then the gentlemen of the king's inner chambers, then the courtiers, ministers, special ambassadors, lords of the king's outer chambers, ladies of the royal robes and seals, visiting noblemen and their families who were a little slower than the rest to hear about anything that happened since they were unfamiliar with palace routine, and at last even the page boys, the downstairs servants, and the entire kitchen staff, none of whom had ever thought to question their monarchs in the slightest detail hitherto, all protested vehemently, desperately, when the king and queen emerged from their private bedroom and, pale but composed, declared that they were going in search of their daughter. They were dressed as though they might be a woodcutter and his wife, except that each wore the gold chain of office that a king or queen was expected to wear, except in the bath, until the day each retired. The keepers of the wardrobe, even through their sorrow, were startled that the king and queen could even find such plain clothes to put on. "No good will come of this," all wailed at them, forgetting in their grief that they were daring to disagree, even hysterically disagree, with their sovereigns. "No good will come of anything that has to do with the fairies," all said, weeping and pulling their hair and patting at the queen's skirts and the king's knees. "What if we lose you too?" The last was at first a murmur, since these people, like people everywhere, believed that bad luck, which in this land meant fairies, may come to investigate discussions of bad luck, but it took hold, and more of the grief-mad palace residents gave up and spoke it aloud, and it swelled till it might have become a panic. "There is nothing to suggest that you are going to," said the king, patiently, or at least nearly so, and the queen, who perhaps understood despair a little better than her husband, said, "Those who are so upset at the idea that they can't stay home may come with us, but only on the condition that they will be quiet." Gilvin gave his wife only one brief, weary look at this, but he could follow the sense behind it, so he said merrily, "You will have a very long walk of it, anyone who does come." But the king's patience and the queen's tenderness, which were perhaps a little obviously delivered as to a crowd of foolish children, had their effect. There was a pause as everyone looked at everyone else, and Elora and Gilvin resignedly overlooked them all. "Let me at least make you some sandwiches," said the chief cook at last, and she wiped her eyes on her white apron and disappeared below. Most of her undercooks and assistants slowly detached themselves from the crowd and followed her, and those who remained sat down, and most of them put their heads in their hands. A few spoke to their particular friends in low tones, and several went to the kitchens themselves to ask that they be provided with sandwiches too. A great many of these were made at last and put in knapsacks with apples and other food that might reasonably survive being banged about in pockets and on shoulders. And some clever person suggested that everybody should bring a blanket. And when the king and queen finally set out, about 20 of their court, all of whom were excellent walkers, went with them. Elora and Gilvin carried their own bundles, and such was the morale of the party that no one dared try to seek that honor for themselves. Elora led them to the meadow where she and Lynadel had seen the small blue flowers years ago. They startled a small herd of Airedale, which fled silently, eyes wide and tails high, veering away from the forest directly ahead of them and entering the trees at the royal party's right hand. Elora stood at the center of the meadow and turned her head first one way and then the other, as if she were listening. Gilvin stood near her, hands in pockets, staring at the sky and squinting, but more, it seemed, at his thoughts than at the sunlight. "This way," she said at last, and led the royal herd into the forest also, but not the way the Airedale had gone. They were deep in the woods when the light began to fail them, and they made a camp of blankets and addressed themselves to the sandwiches. There was a tiny stream that twisted through the trees near where they lay. The water was sweet, and with patience one could fill a water bottle. The king himself built a fire and lit it, and it burnt. Everybody was impressed, which did not please Gilvin. He knew perfectly well he could build a proper fire that would burn, and continue to burn, and not splutter and smoke, even if he was a king. Somebody produced some packets of tea, and somebody's friend turned out to be wearing a thin pot, suitable for boiling water in, under his curiously shaped hat. The king and queen retired a little apart, cupping their hands around the warmth of the tea. The fire was flickering and subsiding into embers, and everybody was choosing a tree to lean against, and roots to get comfortable among, if possible, and dropping off to sleep. "This is the right way," said Elora, "I think." Gilvin nodded. "You think so too, then?" "Not exactly. I feel as though I could tell if it was the wrong one, but I wish I knew where our right way was leading us." "So do I." Elora sounded so young and woebegone that Gilvin told her almost sharply to finish up her tea and go to sleep. They both lay down, and each regulated his or her breathing to make the other one think he or she was asleep, but each lay awake for a long time. It was Gilvin who woke first. In the first thin and hesitant light of dawn, he started another fire with only a very little mumbling under his breath, by which time a sleepy courtier had stumbled up to fetch the water-boiling pot and gone off to the stream to fill it. Elora was still asleep. Gilvin looked down at her for a moment, then looked up to watch the only slightly more awake now courtier set up the pot full of water in a fashion that would give it a fair chance of coming to a boil. He succeeded at last and sat back on his heels to watch that it didn't change its mind and topple over on him. It would take 3 potfuls to make tea for everybody, he sighed. He rubbed his face and eyes with the cold water of the stream, but it only made his skin tingle. His brain was still asleep. Gilvin turned away and, for no particular reason, made his way to the little brook and began walking downstream. He thought he might waste a little time till the water would be hot, and it was easier not to think about Lynadel if he kept moving. His eyes were on his feet, and his hands in fists dug into his pockets and jingling anything he might find there. An absent-minded habit he had had all his life, which ruined the cut of his trousers and reduced the royal tailors to despair. They had finally stopped making pockets for those trousers where the royal dignity could not bear bulges. Gilvin, in his woodcutter's rig, was dimly aware of the luxury of having pockets, but even these thoughts he kept carefully suppressed. The stream widened as he walked. He paused at last, thinking he should turn around and go back, and he looked up. And that's all for the first video. It's kind of cool that I'm reading two parts today because if I were the listener and I had to wait the whole week for the next part, it's an interesting cliffhanger. So it looks like something is going to happen next. So we'll stop here for this video and then continue in the next video. Thanks for watching.